This week, setting scope limitations with your external pen testers and red teamers. And is the MSSP model the wave of the future? That and the latest news and trends in the managed security space coming right up on Cyber for Hire.
Building bridges between managed security providers and their clients, it's the podcast where MSPs, vCISOs, and end users take a united stand against cybercrime. This is Cyber for Hire.
Cyber for Hire, the managed security podcast, would like to thank the following initial launch sponsors for supporting our program: Aptega, AT&T Cybersecurity, Cisco, NetSurian, and Stellar Cyber. Be sure to keep watching future episodes for more details on these sponsoring organizations. In the meantime, to learn more about our sponsors, you can visit us at msspalert.com/sponsors for additional information. And of course, be sure to get your fill of timely news and analysis from our partnering digital brands, SC Media, MSSP Alert, and Channel E2E. All right, welcome to episode 1 of Cyber for Hire. How's everybody doing today? I'm Bradley Barth with SC Media in New York, and joining me today on the other side of the Continental Divide is my co-host and partner in cybercrime, Ryan Morris, principal consultant with Morris Management Partners. Ryan, it is our very first show. Are you as excited as I am?
Very excited, and obviously we can't wait to get to our 100th show because there are so many things to talk about in this field. We're only going to talk about one of them today. Boy, there's so much to come.
Oh, there's no question about it. Just almost seems limitless. I'm excited too. Also a little paranoid though. I've done a lot of on-camera interviews at this point with SC Media, but I can never shake that paranoia of something going wrong on camera and then being pretty much captured and preserved forever for all of posterity. You know, having that infamous Zoom moment where, you know, you're either hitting the wrong filter and turning yourself into a cat, or you've got all of a sudden your nieces and nephews running around and fighting in the background. Have you ever had an embarrassing on-camera moment, whether it was a Zoom or Teams call or a journalist interview or anything like that, Ryan?
You know, cameras are inevitably going to catch you at your most awkward moments, and there are plenty of pictures of me out there on stage and on camera with my mouth open and my eyes in weird configurations. My favorite one, though, we actually were doing a session with a client. I had a virtual background, and it was a little bit less than perfect, and so when I did, as we were signing off, I gave the peace sign, and I did it above my shoulders. And as you can imagine, sometimes it blurs out just one of your fingers. And they captured that for posterity. And it's frequently shared around the organization.
Well, I'm sure you were just saying you're number one. I have an issue where, I've done some interviews for some of our virtual conferences and webcasts. And in the wintertime, I have a tendency to wear cardigan sweaters sometimes, V-neck cardigans. And so to me, it looked fine on camera in the mirror. Then afterwards, I heard from somebody who watches a lot of my interviews, and the guy said to me, "Were you wearing a bathrobe?" And I'm like, a bathrobe? Like, no, we haven't gotten quite that informal yet on camera. He's like, it looked like a bathrobe. And I kind of dismissed it, but then I had also heard from a second person who also asked me if I was wearing a robe. And I was like, okay, I might have to stop with the cardigan sweaters or make sure that the camera angle is such that people can actually see what I'm wearing. So that was probably my most embarrassing on-camera moment.
It is an entirely new skill set we've all had to develop in the last 2.5 to 3 years. We're all now amateur video producers and audio technicians so that we can look a little bit less terrible when we're on camera. And I think I've got my certification in lighting and framing and microphone placement, all of those things. But it still makes sure that you're going to get captured at your most awkward moments. But Brad, I would say going forward, please feel free to wear a bathrobe here if you would like.
I'll pass on that, I think, but I would certainly love to hear if anybody else has any embarrassing Zoom or on-camera moments. You're right that it's something we're all going through. It's a work-from-home kind of environment now. Ryan, maybe tell our audience how they can share some of their own embarrassing Zoom stories.
As with all of the topics we discuss on this program, we want this to be an interactive conversation. So for those of you listening in, please do share with us your most embarrassing on-camera moments, where you can find us at cyber4hire at cyberriskalliance.com. That's our show email address. And if we get some good ones and some safe for work ones, we will be happy to share some of those on future episodes.
Absolutely. And so with that, it's time for our featured security news topic of the day, presenting our big idea in security. Setting scope expectations and limitations with your offensive security service providers. Companies must communicate clear expectations when contracting with pen testers, red teams, and vulnerability hunters in order to set key ground rules for what data and systems can be accessed, what's off limits, and who's responsible if something breaks. Of course, if you set too many restrictions and parameters, then how do you really know if you're safe from malicious hackers who, of course, they don't play by the rules? So addressing this thorny issue today is our guest, Chris McCurdy. He is Worldwide Vice President and General Manager at IBM Security. Chris has more than 25 years in the IT consulting services industry and has been with IBM Security since 2006. Before joining IBM, Chris was managing consultant at several consulting firms, including Anderson International Network Services and Lucent Technologies. He was also a former CIO at a large retail automotive group. Chris, thanks so much for being here.
Brad, Ryan, great to be here and great to be on air with you. And hopefully I don't make any of those mistakes on video. I have had some sound issues, but we'll keep that for the next episode.
All right, sounds good. Well, what would you say, Chris, is the biggest omission or misunderstanding when a company contracts with an offensive security services provider to perform some kind of red teaming or pen testing operation? Where can the lines of communication break down?
You bet, Brad. Great question. And you kicked it off really well about some of the pen testers and some of the communication gaps that exist. Being remote, sometimes we're not face to face and we miss some of those things that we need to pay attention to. So communication is critical in exercising and running adversary simulation, pen testing, threat hunting. And some of those, sometimes people just forget about something really, really basic, like, hey, when am I supposed to stop testing and when can I start testing? Or is there a change control window that I need to be thinking about? So just small things that come into mind that when we get testers and engaging. So one of the things that we've done at IBM is ensure that we have a means of communication with a portal. So any part of the organization that's contracting can use this portal to communicate back and forth, giving critical information about some of the testing. So inputs, outputs, where you store reports, how those reports are stored, making sure they're encrypted and protected during the entire testing process, because we don't want some of that valuable information that is communicated in the wrong way out to particular people that you may not be thinking about, which then ties back into getting a services agreement tied to that. So contracting, third-party risk is really a critical piece of this. Getting all that right up front can save a lot of time on the back end.
See, that's great. It's very good and very tactical advice, Chris, which is kind of what we want to make sure people take away from this conversation. The reason we do offensive and pen testing, offensive cybersecurity, it's not just to verify that you have security, but to test whether it is sufficient to keep the bad actors out and to ensure the privacy and security of your data and information. As you get into these kinds of relationships with customers, I'm sure that there are times where they might not want the weaknesses to be found, but when you engage those kinds of environments where a customer is pushing back and saying, we don't want you to test here, we don't want you to do this type of testing, how do you deal with that kind of politics and or pressure to kind of paint a rosy picture.
Yeah. So Ryan, going back to the communication side, a lot of times people don't want that to be disclosed or want something to be found. So they give as little information as possible, which is sometimes the right way to test, depending on the type of test that you're going for. We look at testing as a way to better improve the organization, to get the outcome that you want. This is all for the betterment of the organization, to be able to identify vulnerabilities in the organization before the wrong person discovers it. So making sure that there's a level of comfort, there's a level of trust with the two organizations as we're going through the testing process is critical. Knowing the expected outcome of why we're doing this together, why we're partnering. Many times in the organization, there is one person that we would call the referee. So in the example of a red team or even a purple team, where we're trying to make the blue team much better. We're trying to make sure that we can detect the things in the environment that we expect to detect. We built a use case for a reason. We want to test against that use case, but have someone that acts like a hacker that doesn't know the organization really well. I see a lot of companies that build their own red teaming organization. The problem with just engaging your own internal red team is they know where the holes are. They know where the gaps are. They feel like I've got to at least find something. But it's about getting better. It's about how do we improve the protection strategy organization so that way we can do that detect and respond. And that's really what a lot of this red teaming, purple teaming that we're going on with organizations now is detect and respond. I've said many times to organizations, give up. I don't really mean give up. What I mean is hey, the protection strategies only go far. There's new vulnerabilities that get found every day. That's why we have to make our companies so much better in detect and respond. That way, when something does go wrong, inevitably it will, which you guys have seen a lot, is how does the organization respond to that vulnerability? So let's go ahead and find them before they actually happen.
Chris, can you give us a couple of examples of run-ins that you had with an organization that you contracted with as a client where they said something like, hey, you didn't tell us that you were going to be using this tool or this tactic, and then you had to explain to them and work out that issue with them?
Yeah, Brad, it happens all the time. When our testers come into organizations, they utilize tools that they've built. They use third-party tools. They use open source tools that are commonly available out on the internet. Not only are we using them as the good guys, the testers that you contract, but also the guys that you don't want in your environment. So we've had several incidents where organizations are very particular about the software that runs in their environment, the software that runs on their laptops and servers. If you don't have proper responsibility of those tools, then you're not allowed to run them in the environment. And so as we've done some of the testing, even they come back to us as the group that's supposed to be attacking them and say, wait a second, before you test in our environment, you have to have authorized usage of the tools that you're bringing in. And I had to stop the engagement because as the CISO says, or the CIO, or even the chief risk officer, you're not allowed to use any tools against us that we don't authorize. So I stopped and I said, okay, is on a Friday night and a Saturday night, when the hacker comes into your environment and utilizes these tools, are you going to stop them? Are you going to tell them you can't hack on me anymore? You can't break into my environment because you're not authorized. So it's a little bit of an eye opener. And then they go, yeah, you're right. Continue on. Keep going with your practices. Just don't bring us down.
See, the human side of this, I think, is very interesting, right? Our point of view on this program is not just the cybersecurity, but the relationship between the service provider and the end customer. And as you deal with those kinds of things, obviously, as you say, decision makers have certain priorities. They're going to be focusing for a certain outcome. And sometimes it's just, I checked a box and said I did the testing, therefore I'm good. You're focused on that business objective or the outcome of actually making them better in an environment. But on our side of the table, as service providers, sometimes the people who are the very best at offensive cybersecurity are maybe not the best at communicating what we are doing and why. How do you, as that outside third party, how do you get your team to communicate and engage effectively with the non-security professionals they might encounter?
Yeah, Ryan, it's critical, and we talked about that in Brad's first question. Is the importance of communication and doing this. What I encourage is regular communication with teams, is showing them how a vulnerability can lead to something bad in an environment. So people like to quantify the overall risk of a vulnerability, and sometimes it may not be understood. We have to take a step back and really explain, here is the potential risk or potential exposure of this vulnerability. In our language, you use things like CVSS or Common Vulnerability Scoring System. That may not mean anything to a CEO or a CFO, not understanding the potential risk of a specific CVE or a 0-day until you can show them how it can be exploited and what they can gain access to. So taking a step back and easily communicating that isn't something that's done all the time. So I encourage, one, frequent communication. So as we find or identify vulnerabilities, we do what we call mind mapping. So we take a vulnerability and we show how we would exploit a particular environment, or how one vulnerability can then move to something else inside the environment. If we look left or look right, it gives a different story and helps people in the business understand, why is this so risky? But then helps our testers understand, what is the business impact? And that's really what we're going for, is to understand business impact. It doesn't mean data exfiltration all the time when someone enters your environment. It could mean a compromise of an OT system that brings down a plant or manufacturing environment. What is the real impact of that? Is it dollars per minute? Is it hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars? When we can equate to that and show what a vulnerability can then do, it really gets across the entire organization so that we can really understand the business impact of those critical high, mediums, or even lows sometimes to the organization.
Chris and Ryan, for that matter, you both mentioned the human element of things as a consideration when dealing with these types of relationships. So let me ask, in some cases, when you're testing the security of a company, you might be testing just specifically their systems. In other cases, you might actually be seeing if they are vulnerable through their employees and vulnerable through their human element. You might try to phish them or socially engineer them. Is there a delicate balance there to consider when you're actually trying to infiltrate a company through their employees to make sure that they're not feeling somewhat victimized? I know you even gave me an example of a CEO that you worked with one time who was fooled by a phishing attack and who was not very pleased by it.
Yeah. So Brad, it happens all the time, but it is, as we see in some of our studies, still the most common attack vector in an organization is phishing attacks. And it proved out again in 2021. And I will tell you, in the incidents that we work every single day, it's going to prove out again in 2022, is that initial threat vector of compromise through a phishing attack, giving away user ID and password and credentials. We get phished as examples in tests, and I still see some of our security professionals all around the world fall for it. But the business people that get these emails that are actually conducting what they believe is good business, they get these emails and are very, very good these days, and can hit businesses at the time of when they're going through. As an example, I've seen benefits enrollment. And so they start to get very sophisticated in their attack types because they're used to seeing benefits enrollment at the last 3 months of the year. So now they get this new benefits enrollment phishing expedition, and it's easily clicked on. I can tell you one organization, 30 minutes into this phishing exercise that we did, the CEO, as you mentioned, actually called off the exercise and said, "This is too much. It's going too far." Yet that's what we're here for. We're here to help exercise the teams, to make them better. Again, it's not about how many people did we trick. It's how can we exercise? How can we help make our teams more aware and understand the different attack types and the threat vectors? And when we know it's phishing, the more we can educate, the better they're going to get, the more secure our environments are.
See, again, it is very important that our teams understand the business objective of the customer as well as the business objective of us, the service provider, right? The inherent nature of what we do. We might be very good at the technology. We might be very good at service operations, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're good at the business of cybersecurity. So I wonder, from your point of view, how do you structure the third-party client relationship? How do you convince the non-technical professionals that might not be involved in these exercises? How do we convince them of value? And then how do you set up this engagement in a way that's it's not just effective for the customer, but it's also profitable for you?
Yeah, and we do a number of these different types of tests. And I'll take adversary simulation as an example. We have a lot of customers that are looking at their OT environments and their IoT devices that sit in their environment these days, as an example. And I had one of the clients come and say, look, we have autonomous vehicles driving around, and we need to understand the potential impact. We're dealing with lives now. So we're not just talking about lost credentials or lost PII data. We could get into healthcare environments. We talk about radiology devices that could be compromised while a surgeon is operating on someone. What's the potential impact? We're now talking about lives. So in some of these adversary simulation engagements, taking control of an OT device like a truck driving around a mine, as an example. If it's driving around and someone is able to compromise it, and you can smash that into something where there's potentially human life, there's a bigger risk and a bigger impact, because safety is very important. I gave a speech on safety, and we see a lot of industrial clients and manufacturing. They give safety moments all the time. Before every meeting, in fact, that I sit with, and I say is, what about a security moment? Why aren't we talking about security moments that could lead to a safety moment? And that's what we need to think about is the potential compromise. We're now looking at these OT devices, these IoT things that could cause potential loss of life or impact to life. So now as we start communicating these impacts to the business and the business operations, it changes their perspective. It's just not a CISO's job of security to ensure. It's the entire organization. And that's really what we're trying to stress is we're trying to show how can security help protect the entire organization by reducing that overall risk to the business.
Chris, I mentioned in the lead into this segment that there's also a consideration around what happens when something breaks and then who's liable for that. So again, what kind of best practices need to be followed in the early going with contractually and negotiation to make sure that if in the event something does happen, something breaks, it's established who's responsible for making sure that gets fixed, who's paying for that, and especially a situation where maybe the pen testers also want to make sure that they're not going to be held criminally responsible in some way. You have the infamous case with the coal fire pen testers who were arrested outside of an Iowa courthouse for picking a lock, even though they believed it was fully within their scope. So how do you account for all of that, those type of scenarios in advance?
Yeah, Brad, I'll start from the very beginning. It's critical that organizations, and being a consumer as well as a tester, right, as a former CIO, I had to make sure that I was holding our service provider accountable in my previous role. So having procurement, having legal tied into these engagements to make sure that you've got good limits of liability, you've got a good understanding of indemnification, but once you get past those types of things and governing all the types of testing that you're going to be doing as part of this is having that relationship between the tester or the testing organization and the company itself. So it's important on those open lines of communication. So how far do we go with the test type? So we're trying to help the organization get better, as I said. So once we get to a certain point, we may have to stop the test and say, can we continue? Should we proceed? We were able to get this data. I don't necessarily need to do data exfiltration to be able to say, I have compromised the data, right? But do you want me to take it out? I have compromised the IoT device by gaining access to its user ID and password and credentials. Is there another way that we can go test this as opposed to testing in a production environment? So we'll stop the test typically, and we'll have guidelines, we'll have policies and procedures already established with the team. So that way, as we're engaging and we're working, because most of the time, as we said, our clients like us to do this remotely. We don't have to go on site to do testing. It should not be a requirement for companies to do that because typically the attacker is sitting on his couch in his house or at a nearby coffee station or out in the parking lot. There's no requirement to be on site. There's no requirement to be nearby. We want to be just like that attacker. So we want to be able to understand what the environment looks like. But at some point in time before we do something catastrophic or dangerous, we think about those things because our mind is, how do we make this device do something it's not supposed to do? So we have that in mind of that reverse engineering, but that mind mapping helps us draw that out. So we're drawing, here's the compromised or the endpoint that we're going after. How would we go about getting there? But those are all well-known avenues and paths, and we're going to stop the attack when we know that there could be an area of compromise, but that's already agreed upon up front, and we have that point of contact that is really going to help us decide, should we continue this? Can we do a source code review in production? Is it going to potentially bring something down? Would load impact what we're doing? So those are the types of things that we just like to understand and be able to have someone on the other side that goes, I trust this team. They're part of, extended part of my team. They're going to do the right thing by me.
And, you know, Chris, you make an absolutely vital point around the inclusion of not just IT, but also the OT environment. And I think many service providers in the space have missed that initial transition, right? We are all focused on the stack of technology. We're here at the network and the storage and the application levels, but we don't necessarily spend our time over in actual business or industrial applications. My question to you, as you're packaging those kinds of engagements, how do you is IT and OT the same kind of a contractual engagement? Are they separate pricing schedules? How do you distinguish those kinds of engagements in your operation?
So Ryan, great question. We like to make a single consumable contract for our clients. So that way procurement really likes the way we package in a fixed price manner. So that way we take the procurement team out of the path. We don't have to do RFPs. We don't have to do separate SOWs. We have a SKU-based pricing model with a fixed price that's agreed upon up front. That way, the end user has the option to come to us with the type of test that's already been agreed upon at a fixed price. We take out 13 weeks of what we see typically it takes to develop an SOW with an RFP, go out and source, and then select a vendor after going through an orals presentation. But then what we do with our resources is we have specialized resources in IT testing, in OT testing, in hardware testing, in application testing. And Ryan, you know how hard these resources are to find around the world. I don't source specifically in one area because I want the best to be part of my team. So that way, my testing team then is not dependent upon the type of company. It's dependent on the type of test, right? Who is the best person to fit that type of test that you're actually asking me to perform? So now you've got a very flexible, consumable contract that can be used at any time. You've got global resourcing as part of my team that brings in the best types of resources. And then that way we can reduce cycle time in their testing timeline that our clients need.
All right, well, Chris, I feel like we could talk all day, quite honestly. We've barely even begun to cover enough ground on this topic, but alas, we're just about out of time. But we do want you to stick around because we have a segment we'd love for you to participate in called We Speak Geek. Ryan, why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about what We Speak Geek is about?
Thanks, Brad, because I think it's good for us to know each other as humans as well as to understand the technical parts of what we do. And we all know that what our friends and family who are not in this industry think about us and just how particular we are in certain parts of our habits. We embrace it, right? We are all geeks, and we, in one way or another, we can all bond around that issue. So every one of our episodes or so, we want to come back and talk to our guests and say, so what makes you one of us? And Chris, in your world, I'm sure you've got a whole bunch of technology things to focus on, but where would you say that you are a geek?
Ryan, Brett, when I'm not doing security and not hacking into different things, I'm a big football fan. I have a friend who is the owner of a company called Big Game Football, and he makes all his own footballs here in the United States. And makes football for the vast majority of colleges around the world. I mean, around the United States, as well as many of the high schools right here in Texas. But when it comes to footballs, everybody thinks all I see is leather, Chris. But there's a ton of technology in these things, and it's even getting more and more. So everyone remembers Deflategate. Well, my friend decided he was going to put an air pressure pump right in the football. So when the referee comes up and looks, that quarterback wasn't able to deflate the football in between downs and make it really easy for him. As well, how about an RFID chip inside these things? Now that when this football scores the last touchdown of the Super Bowl, someone can scan that football and know its authenticity and know that was the last football that was thrown by that very, very famous quarterback to end his career. His last football goes into Hall of Fame in Canton.
Well, see, I think that's very cool, Chris, because, see, with the RFID chip, I mean, we're always looking for ways to better spot the football, right? That's always one of the most controversial calls. It's almost impossible to overturn on a replay. And there's something where I've always wondered, why can't you put some technology in the football that exactly where the football was when the guy stepped out of bounds or where he was, tackled and down. And I would imagine that could fix that problem.
Brad, go put a patent on it before my friend does. But that's exactly what he's working on. So he wants to be able to take this football and put a grid all the way around each of the fields. And that way, when the player is tackled, the chip in the football knows exactly the spot on the grid. Without a measurement or without sticks having to come out, we know how long these football games take these days. How about we shorten the games a little bit by all those measurements and exactly know when you have a first down or actually 4th and 1?
Do you play fantasy, Chris?
Man, I love fantasy football. I've been in a league since 1988, the same group of guys. And back then, we didn't have technology. It was the newspaper. Today, now my kids even joined me in my league.
Oh, nice. Back-to-back fantasy champion in my league. I just had to show off. Sorry, Ryan. Go on. I apologize.
No. You know what? Everybody wants to hear about our fantasy teams, right? But I am thrilled to know that the technologists in this world are penetrating all of the industries and even the things that we do on our voluntary time. So, Chris, that is a brilliant level of geek technology. And I tell you, you might not be solving like world peace or something, but you are making the world a better place with that kind of technology. So, well done.
I'll pass it along and I'll throw you a football someday.
All right. Well, I think we've had our fill of geekiness for one day. So one last time, I'd like to thank Chris McCurdy for joining us. But don't go anywhere. We're only halfway done. Please return for the second half of our show, including our featured MSP Business and Industry segment, our security news rundown, and a fun little segment we like to call Dear Cyber for Hire. See you in a moment on the other side.